so many authors playing with my heart this year. If you maybe have been around my channel for a long time, and I mean a long time, you might know that The Perks of Being a Wallflower was one of the most formative books for me of all time. It's still one of my favorites of all time. I read it my freshman year of high school because that's the year the movie came out. Earth-shattering novel for me. Really set the tone for my entire high school career. I would not shut up about the fact that I started high school as a Charlie and I ended it as a Patrick. I thought that was so funny. I met Stephen Chbosky at this event in Chicago. He signed my book. Very special to me. Very special! He flipped through and saw that I had underlined things like a cheese ball, and he signed, in the pages. And then he signed my movie, which, if you didn't know, he also wrote and directed. So, all this is just to say, Stephen Chbosky is a very special author for me, but I had sort of accepted the fact that he was a one-novel kind of dude. And truthfully, I had so much respect. So, I was sitting at a coffee shop in May in Chicago. Saw this tweet from Stephen Chbosky. Dear friend, I have a new book coming out, etc., etc. It's a 700-page horror novel. It's okay, I'll sit and wait for this. Obviously, it's gonna be good. He's worked on it for 10 years. It's been 20 years since his last novel. The things that Stephen Chbosky does are brilliant. So, I'm ready. I'm here for it. As soon as it's fall, I see that, people are starting to do interviews and get arcs. I'm emailing publicists at Hatchet, please send me that. So then I get an arc. I did not read the arc because I never fucking do. But I went and bought the hardcover the day it came out. All this personal backstory is very important to the review. Just so you know. Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. Put it next to Perks, which now has an adorable 20th anniversary edition. Look at the difference! I love this so much because obviously Stephen Chbosky doesn't need to be told what to do. He's screenwriting Beauty and the Beast, he's directing Wonder, he's attached to director Evan Hansen. He's got his career solid, and plus his fan base is, solid from Perks. He did not feel the pressure to write another coming-of-age story. He didn't feel the pressure to write another novel in 2014, when someone else who, carrying off the success they had from the Perks movie would have. I know he was working on this during then, but my point stands that Stephen Chbosky is a hero. He really took his time with this novel, and it fucking shows. The pacing in Imaginary Friend is exquisite. If you're unfamiliar, I'm gonna not be very spoilery in this video because I don't think it'd be that productive for me to dive in. I could do a deep dive discussion, but I don't really want to for this. I just want to kind of let it sit with me. In general, I'd say it's very Stephen King. It's very suspenseful, scary, but so much heart. The characters are stunning. I did a full week of reading just so I could crank through this book a little bit. I did an entire reading vlog. The link will be here and in the description. This is the kind of book where every time you pick it up, whether you read a chapter, the chapters are short by the way, or you're reading for 2 hours, shit's gonna go down when you pick it up. And a lot of times when I'm trying to get through a book, I will get the audiobook or I will download it on my Kindle just so I can be reading it on the go. For this, I really just wanted to experience the full hardcover. Turning the pages, reading this just felt a little bit like reading Harry Potter. Imaginary Friend is written in third person and we alternate perspectives. It mostly follows this little boy, Christopher. His mother and him flee from her abusive boyfriend and they move to this little town. Christopher has an imaginary friend who he calls the nice man who disguises himself in this plastic bag. Sounds ridiculous, it's real. So Christopher goes missing for 6 days. He comes back and everything changes for them. His mom wins the lottery, they move into a house, Christopher's learning problems start to go away, and things start changing for everyone in the town. This has the feeling of just a classic horror novel. There's not much about this that would make you say this was definitely from this decade, which is interesting to read because so much of what I read is very timely. Imaginary Friend is very timeless and feels more like a classic, this could have been written in the 80s. And that's why it reminds me so much of a Stephen King novel, especially this short story that Stephen King has called The Man in the Black Suit. There's a section of this book that reminded me so much of that because he talks about the man in the gray suit. He writes in the acknowledgments up front, Emma Watson, who inspired the ending on The Perks of Being a Wallflower set, and Stephen King, who inspired everything else. amazing. My favorite part about this book is just like how creative and cinematic the writing is. Stephen Chbosky is just not afraid to break rules. He's not afraid to change the font for a certain kind of dialogue, or make the font size bigger, or take up an entire page for one line. Even just this random page I flipped to, you can see like how much is italicized, and just like it's very creative and different throughout. I think that is a big part of what pushed me through, is just seeing like how Stephen Chbosky would tell this story. No one else would have told this story like this. I went to an event where Stephen Chbosky was speaking at Book Soup in West Hollywood, and if you don't know yet, I kind of blasted about this on social media, but he brought out Emma Watson, who moderated for him, and while he was introducing her, I started crying because I was in the second row, and like I just like my childhood was just flashing before me, and I was just like so proud of her. Stephen Chbosky read a 20 years later chapter from Perks, which is in the 20th anniversary edition of the book, which I don't have, but it's there, you can read it. But just hearing him read it, life-changing. And it was also just something I needed to hear like that night. So I asked this question: if, you know, after spending 10 years with this story and these characters, if he would ever go back in to do a sequel or adapt to the screen. And he said yes. Curious to see where that'll go. You know, we're obviously gonna have to wait patiently. And I think this would make a stellar miniseries. Like, I think there's 8 episodes in here. I think it's 7 or 8 parts, the novel itself. And so I think all of those parts would be an amazing hour-long episode. It definitely, I don't think, should be a movie. I mean, there's so much that you would have to cut, and I think the pacing is just too good to sacrifice that. The character development is just exquisite, and so, you know, the way that we slowly follow Mary Catherine, the way that everyone ties together, like all of the kids, especially in the age of like Stranger Things, this would go over fantastically. Another example of how Stephen Chbosky is just a master of like tone setting and writing style is that this book is, like I said, full of so much heart. It's very much like a family story, just as it is a horror story. And it gets gruesome. It does. But not for like 100 or 2 pages. And so the first chapter, we're following David Olson, who's this other little boy 50 years before. He becomes extremely relevant later on. But that sets the tone for just like the creepiness of the book. It reminds us that like shit's gonna go down in this book, and just you wait. And so while we're sort of, you know, getting into the family and the school and the home life of Christopher and his mom Kate, we're reminded of this like sort of cold opening chapter that we had. The way he dealt with all of the characters was also just really brilliant. Like, Kate Reese, Christopher's mother, would often just be referred to as Christopher's mother. You know, that was her role in the story. And there's this sheriff who, like, we learn his name, but you forget it because he's only ever referenced as the sheriff. If you're not a fan of horror, but you're a fan of Perks of Being a Wallflower, you truly will enjoy this book. You will. If you're a fan of horror anyway, and you haven't read this book, and maybe you're not into like the coming of age, you will fucking love this book. It's so creative and fresh, and will probably remind you lots of your other favorite horror stories, because I think that's what inspired this for Stephen Chbosky. He talks about how Perks came from his love of coming of age stories, like Catcher in the Rye. This comes from his favorite horror stories, and it's also completely original and amazing. That's about all I want to say, I think, about Imaginary Friend. It's a wild ride. It's insane. It's a reread for sure, if you're the kind of person who likes to do that. Yeah, 700 pages of absolute madness and insanity, this book. There's no other way to put it. So, my name is Tiernan. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys very soon with another video, and have a good one.